Medieval soldiers didn't just appear out of nowhere. Behind every army was a system built to find and shape fighters from the ground up. It was tough, strict, and nothing like what most people picture today. Let's step into the world that built them from the ground up. While modern kids dream of becoming astronauts or YouTube stars, medieval boys rarely had such luxury of choice. Most future soldiers didn't daydream about becoming knights. They were straight up told that's what they'd be. No career counseling, no options, just here's your wooden sword, don't poke your eye out. The path to knighthood began shockingly early. By age 7, yes, 7 when most kids today are still figuring out multiplication tables, boys were sent away to become squires. These weren't your typical chores like taking out trash or feeding the dog. Their daily tasks included cleaning heavy metal armor until it shined, feeding massive war horses that could easily stomp them flat, and serving as living practice dummies for older trainees. These poor kids were basically living combat mannequins, learning the art of how not to die before they even understood what dying meant. Bedtime stories? Forget those fairy tales. These boys got bedtime combat drills instead. Lessons about vulnerable body parts and how to protect them replaced gentle stories about magical creatures. Historical records show that some squires could recite 50 different sword techniques before they could even write their own names. Their education was relentlessly practical. While they did learn to read, it wasn't so they could enjoy poetry, it was to memorize battle commands and military strategies. Math wasn't taught for intellectual development, but for calculating supplies, siege angles, and the depressing odds of survival. One particularly amusing fact: some young squires wore special wooden collars during meals to force proper posture. Nothing says enjoyable childhood like choking on bread because you slouched. These boys essentially grew up with weapons instead of toys, forming calluses before their voices deepened. Their childhood games weren't tag, but exercises in survival and combat readiness. They learned to endure pain, follow orders, and prepare for a life that would demand absolute loyalty and sacrifice. The transformation from child to warrior began early, a harsh reality that shaped not just individuals, but the entire medieval world. As these young boys grew stronger and more skilled, the real challenges of becoming a true medieval soldier were only just beginning. After those early years of squire duties came the real test: full combat training. This wasn't your average workout. This was suffering with a purpose. Morning routines began before sunrise with running drills while wearing chainmail. A full set of chainmail could weigh up to 60 pounds, like carrying a third grader on your shoulders while trying to sprint. Soldiers didn't need alarm clocks. The screaming of their leg muscles did the job just fine. Sword practice dominated most of the day. Records from medieval training camps show that soldiers would perform the same strike hundreds of times daily until their movements became automatic. Your arm might feel like it was falling off, but precision wasn't optional. It was the difference between coming home on your horse or being carried home on your shield. Weather didn't stop training. Rain turned practice fields into mud pits. Snow numbed fingers until holding a weapon became its own challenge. Heat made armor feel like personal cooking pots. One historical account from a 13th century training master noted that men who complain of conditions will find battle conditions considerably less comfortable. Wrestling formed another brutal cornerstone of combat preparation. Soldiers learned to grapple, throw, and pin opponents, skills that could save their lives if they lost their weapons in battle. These wrestling matches often drew crowds of off-duty soldiers who placed bets on the outcomes, turning pain into entertainment. Food during training was basic but plentiful. Armies understood hungry soldiers couldn't train effectively. A typical daily ration included 2 pounds of bread, half a pound of meat or fish, and watered-down wine or ale. The diet was designed to build strength, not finesse. Medieval soldiers didn't worry about counting calories. They worried about counting how many hits they could take before falling over. Sleep came quickly for exhausted trainees, often on straw mattresses and shared quarters where snoring competitions rivaled the day's combat drills in intensity. The physical training shaped their bodies, but battles required more than just muscle. A soldier also needed to master the mental challenges of warfare. Contrary to popular belief, medieval battles weren't just chaotic brawls where everyone swung weapons until one side ran away. They were chaotic brawls with a plan. The mental aspect of warfare was just as important as physical strength. though admittedly less impressive at parties. Soldiers spent hours memorizing battlefield signals. Trumpets, drums, and flags all conveyed specific commands that needed to be understood instantly. A single missed horn blast could mean charging when you should retreat, a mistake few made twice. Medieval commanders had to invent dozens of signals because run for your lives needed at least 15 different variations. Formations were critical to survival. The shield wall, where soldiers locked their shields together to create a nearly impenetrable barrier, required perfect coordination. One soldier stopping to fix his hair could collapse the entire wall and get everyone killed. Medieval history's earliest recorded teamwork exercise. This explains why stay in formation was yelled more often than actual battle cries. Documents from the 14th century reveal that some armies practiced forming and reforming ranks up to 20 times a day. The discipline required was enormous, especially when arrows were flying overhead and the natural instinct was to duck, run, or both. Silent communication became essential too. Hand gestures allowed soldiers to coordinate without alerting enemies to their movements. A medieval military manual from 1326 listed 42 different hand signals for common battlefield actions. These included signals for enemy archers ahead, cavalry approaching, and the commander has terrible breath, but don't mention it. For cavalry, the mental challenges multiplied. Riders needed to control their horses while wielding weapons and staying in formation. Studies of cavalry training schedules show that riders spent 3 times as many hours on coordination drills as they did on actual weapon practice. Horses didn't care about battle plans or glory. They just wanted to know why humans insisted on running toward the scary metal things instead of away from them. More than one battle was decided when horses made the sensible decision to retreat without asking permission. Perhaps most impressive was the mental fortitude required to march into battle knowing the odds of survival. Records indicate that in some major battles, up to 50% of frontline infantry didn't survive their first encounter. Basically, medieval battle plans boiled down to, half of you won't make it, but we're pretty sure which half, so stand over there. While these mental aspects were drilled into career soldiers, those recruited from villages had a much steeper learning curve. Finding these new recruits required its own special set of skills. Medieval recruitment wasn't exactly a career fair with free pens and promises of dental coverage. The town crier method was perhaps the most straightforward. A royal representative would show up in the village square and announce that the king needed fighters. These announcements typically featured exciting phrases like mandatory service and refusal punishable by hanging. Nothing motivates potential recruits like the perfect blend of patriotism and thinly veiled threats. Contrary to romantic tales of volunteers rushing to defend their homeland, many medieval armies relied heavily on forced recruitment. Records from the 100 Years' War show that English kings often demanded each county provide a specific number of able-bodied men. Village elders then had the unpleasant task of deciding which young men would be sent off. The selection criteria often boiled down to, who can we most afford to lose from the harvest? For those who couldn't be convinced through patriotic speeches or direct threats, there was always bribery. A 14th century French recruitment ledger shows payments ranging from 3 months' wages up front to promises of land after service. Many took these offers simply because they beat starvation. Medieval recruitment slogans might as well have been, "Join the army. You might die, but at least it won't be from hunger." Prison recruitment drives provided another source of cannon fodder. Convicts were often given the choice between rotting in dungeons or taking their chances on the battlefield. Many chose the latter, reasoning that arrows at least killed you faster than prison diseases. Military historians estimate that in some campaigns, up to 20% of forces consisted of former prisoners, proving that second chances sometimes came with extremely sharp strings attached. The most desperate times called for the most desperate measures. Impressment. This fancy term meant grabbing men off streets or from taverns and forcing them into service. An account from 1346 describes 50 men being taken from London markets in a single day, still holding the vegetables they'd been buying. These freshly gathered troops, whether willing or unwilling, now faced the daunting task of transforming from ordinary peasants into something resembling soldiers. The leap from farmer to fighter wasn't exactly smooth. One day you're worrying about crop rotation, the next you're being told to stab the man running towards you with an axe. The transition period was brief, brutal, and often fatal. Training for these reluctant recruits was nothing like the years-long education received by knights. Many peasant soldiers got a crash course that lasted mere weeks, sometimes just days, if battle loomed. An analysis of training records from the Battle of Agincourt shows some English archers received only 4 days of instruction before facing the French. 4 days to learn archery is like having 4 minutes to learn brain surgery, except the patient is trying to kill you. Equipment distribution came with its own challenges. Armor was handed out based on your importance to the battle plan, not your size. Too small? Tough luck. Too big? Stuff it with hay. Records from the 1415 English campaign in France show that 30% of infantry complained their helmets blocked their vision, a problem that solved itself when many of them didn't survive long enough to file a second complaint. The brief training focused on absolute essentials. First, how not to accidentally kill the guy standing next to you. Second, how to follow basic commands. And third, how to look intimidating while secretly wondering how you got yourself into this mess. Newly recruited soldiers learned to march in formation by having sergeants whack their legs with sticks when they stepped out of line, a teaching method yet to be embraced by modern educational systems. Some armies used a unique training approach where recruits first practiced with wooden weapons. A Venetian military document from 1321 explains this wasn't just to prevent training injuries, but to teach control before handing over actual steel. The document notes that a man who can swing a wooden sword without hitting himself has mastered half the battle, setting the bar impressively low for medieval combat success. Many peasant recruits brought their modified farm tools into battle. Scythes, flails, and pitchforks became weapons of war. These familiar tools gave farmers turned fighters some confidence, though military historians note this confidence often evaporated upon first contact with properly armed opponents. These hastily trained troops needed weapons they could learn to use quickly. After all, a battlefield was no place for complicated instruction manuals. Whatever tools these new soldiers wielded, they had to be effective enough to keep them alive through their first battle. What actually filled the hands of medieval soldiers? Despite what movies show, not everyone wielded gleaming swords and fancy battle axes. Most soldiers carried weapons that were cheap, effective, and didn't require years of training to use. Spears reigned supreme on medieval battlefields for good reason. Inexpensive to make, they gave soldiers the advantage of reach and required minimal training to use effectively. A basic spear cost about 1/3 the price of a sword, making it the budget-friendly option for equipping large armies. The spear was essentially the fast food burger of medieval weapons, cheap, available everywhere, and gets the job done even if it lacks glamour. Formations of spearmen created deadly walls of points that kept enemies at a distance. The tactic was simple but effective. Keep the pointy end facing the enemy and try not to poke your friends. Archaeological evidence from battlefield graves shows that many fatal wounds came from spear thrusts to the chest or face, evidence that even simple weapons could be devastatingly effective. Swords, by contrast, were the luxury sports cars of medieval warfare. Expensive, flashy, and usually owned by the wealthy. A good sword could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for an average worker. This explains why most common soldiers never owned one, despite their prominence in tapestries and tales. Axes, clubs, and maces served as brutal alternatives. These weapons crushed armor rather than trying to pierce it. A direct hit from a warhammer could cave in a helmet and the skull beneath it. Records from the Battle of Towton in 1461 show skull injuries indicating tremendous force, some with perfect hammer-shaped indentations. Many peasant soldiers simply modified their familiar farm tools. Flails, used for threshing grain, became military flails. Scythes were straightened into vicious pole arms. This weapon's recycling was both practical and psychologically comforting. Soldiers could wield tools they already knew how to use. Battlefield effectiveness trumped beauty every time. A sword might win duels in poetry, but a farmer with a pointy stick could still ruin your day if you weren't careful. The weapons were undeniably brutal, but they only told half the story. Medieval armor illustrates one of warfare's eternal truths. Staying alive often means sacrificing comfort. Evolution of armor tells the story of soldiers desperately trying not to die while still being able to move. Let's start with the dream. Full plate armor, shining articulated steel covering every vulnerable body part. The medieval equivalent of a personal tank. Crafted by master armorers, a complete suit could cost as much as a modern house. Only the wealthiest warriors had full plate, which meant most soldiers went into battle with the medieval equivalent of using a paper umbrella in a hurricane. For most soldiers, protection came in more affordable packages. Chainmail, thousands of interlocking metal rings, offered reasonable protection against slashing but did little against crushing blows. A complete mail shirt weighed between 25 and 40 pounds, all hanging from the shoulders. After a day of fighting in chainmail, soldiers walked like they'd aged 50 years. Their backs had opinions about armor, and those opinions weren't positive. Then there was the notorious helmet problem. Early versions protected the top of the head but left the face exposed. Later helmets covered everything but limited vision dramatically. One German training manual from 1415 advised knights to practice fighting in helmets until they could identify friend from foe, or at least aim in the general direction of the enemy. Medieval helmet design perfectly embodied the principle of you can have safety or peripheral vision, but definitely not both. Leather armor served the poorest soldiers, offering minimal protection but maximum flexibility. These men would wear layers of hardened leather, hoping an enemy would aim for the reinforced parts and not the gaps between. Historical records show this hope rarely paid off. Heat posed another deadly challenge. Fighting in full armor during summer was like battling inside an oven. Medieval medical texts describe knights collapsing from heat exhaustion before the battle even began. One creative solution involved squires pouring water over their knights between skirmishes, turning expensive armor into steaming metal saunas. Despite all these drawbacks, proper armor often meant the difference between life and death. For all its flaws, a good set of protection allowed its wearer to take risks that unarmored soldiers couldn't dream of. This advantage created a clear dividing line on the battlefield. At the top of the medieval military food chain sat the knights, warriors who enjoyed privileges that common soldiers could only dream about. Their elevated status came with better equipment, extensive training, and the expectation they wouldn't run away at the first sign of trouble. Knights began their journey early, often at age 7, and underwent years of training before earning their spurs. By the time they reached battlefield-ready status, they'd spent more time training than most peasant soldiers would live after their first battle. A knight's education included weapon mastery, horsemanship, and tactical understanding, skills that common soldiers acquired through the less formal method of figure it out or die trying. The equipment difference was striking. While foot soldiers hoped for a helmet that wouldn't blind them, knights rode into battle wearing full armor, carrying custom-made weapons, and mounted on specially bred war horses that cost more than a peasant would earn in a lifetime. These war horses weren't your average farm nags. They were massive animals standing up to 18 hands high and weighing over 2,000 pounds, bred for strength and courage. The medieval battlefield had a clear class division. Knights got to shout, "Charge!" while foot soldiers silently added, directly into those spears, in their heads. Knights trained in elaborate combat exercises called melees, basically organized brawls on horseback where noble warriors practiced killing each other with blunted weapons. Historical records show these training sessions sometimes turned deadly anyway. A tournament in 1241 saw 7 knights die when a practice melee escalated into a real battle. Medieval knights apparently had trouble understanding the concept of friendly competition when holding sharp objects. Despite their privileged status, knights didn't have it easy. They spent hours each day in physical training, suffered from chronic injuries, and had to maintain expensive equipment. Many went into debt just keeping up appearances. Being a knight meant balancing the glory of elite status with practical realities like learning to sleep in metal and trying not to fall off a horse while wearing 60 pounds of armor. The training of these elite warriors provided a framework for battlefield success, but experience taught what no practice could: the brutal reality of medieval combat, where even the best training could be undone by a single mistake or stroke of bad luck. You could train for years, but nothing taught faster than getting ambushed in the mud. The real education for medieval soldiers began when the first arrow whistled past their ear. Suddenly, all those drills made terrifying sense. Battle was chaotic, deafening, and nothing like practice. The neat formations fractured as soon as combat began. Battlefield accounts from the 100 Years' War describe how green recruits would freeze up entirely when first experiencing combat, their minds unable to process the sensory overload. Survival taught lessons that no training master could. Medieval soldiers quickly learned to identify which sounds meant immediate danger, the distinct whoosh of an incoming arrow volley or the drumming of cavalry hooves. A French chronicler from 1356 noted that veteran soldiers could smell an ambush before seeing any evidence of one. The most important skill veterans developed wasn't fancy swordplay, it was knowing when to run away. Medieval battle manuals don't mention this, but battlefield graves tell the story. Those buried with wounds to their backs often made the wiser choice than those with wounds to their chests. Combat taught brutal efficiency. Veterans learned to strike at the gaps in armor, the armpit, behind the knee, or the eye slits of helmets. A recovered battlefield journal from 1403 describes a veteran instructing new recruits to forget everything, just stab where they breathe. Leadership emerged from experience rather than rank. Men followed those who kept them alive. Military records show field promotions often went to common soldiers who demonstrated coolness under fire rather than those with noble connections. Survival created a brotherhood no training camp could forge. The shared experience of facing death created bonds between soldiers that lasted lifetimes. The aftermath of medieval warfare was rarely glorious. Many soldiers never made it home, their bodies left in unmarked graves far from family and friends. Those who survived carried more than just physical scars. For the lucky ones who lived through multiple campaigns, a return to civilian life awaited. Some knight commanders received land grants and titles. Records from 11th century Norman England show that approximately 1/3 of William the Conqueror's knights were rewarded with estates after his invasion. Common soldiers faced harsher realities. Most returned to the farms and trades they'd left behind, bringing back injuries that made manual labor difficult. Medieval pension plans consisted mainly of try not to starve and hope your children take care of you. Some veterans transformed their experiences into new careers. Former soldiers became military trainers, weapons crafters, or mercenaries who sold their skills to the highest bidder. A study of 14th century mercenary contracts reveals that veterans could earn 3 times what they'd made as regular soldiers. Many passed down their hard-earned knowledge. Training methods evolved based on battlefield experiences, with each generation learning from the mistakes of the last. The most lasting legacy was cultural. Tales of battles shaped medieval society's understanding of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Through songs, stories, and monuments, medieval soldiers who had once been ordinary people became the building blocks of legends that continue to fascinate us today.